I'm Ed Alexander. I've been a business and technology lawyer for the past 17 years. And before that, I was involved in high technology businesses as an engineer and as a marketing person. Let's begin with some really critical information. Trade secrets, know-how, and confidential information are the most valuable forms of intellectual property for most businesses. The key here is that if any of them are disclosed without proper contractual or legal protection, they're lost. In other words, you can't stop others from using that intellectual property without your permission if you disclose it improperly. This form will help you avoid doing that. So let's just talk a little bit about non-disclosure agreements, because I think that's important to set the background. A lot of people take the position that a non-disclosure agreement is, hey, it's just a form, it doesn't really matter, does it? Well, actually it really does. There are several key issues that have to be determined in a confidentiality agreement to make it enforceable. Now let me start off by saying, hey, do we need to use a confidentiality agreement at all? And that may sound kind of strange given what I just said in the beginning, but let me ask you, have you ever been on a blind date? Now, if you have, and you started that blind date by asking the person out of the box, hey, you know, you look pretty good. Do you want to get married? Do you want to have kids? How many kids do you want to have? I don't think that blind date would last too long. Yet companies often rush into a confidentiality agreement when really they shouldn't do it. They need to find out, hey, is this a good match? And there's a really important distinction between what the confidential information does, or what the outcome of it is, versus how the actual details of the confidential information. And so it's very important that when you think about using a confidentiality agreement and disclosing trade secrets, know-how, or confidential information, that you do that only after everyone has decided that there's a business reason to continue the relationship, because the business reason is going to be the driver. Next, when it comes to doing disclosures, there's often a David and Goliath arrangement here. Now, the one thing I want to tell you is that David and Goliath usually doesn't work out anywhere except in the Bible, right? The David, that would be you, the smaller company with the confidentiality agreement, usually gets crushed by Goliath. And what this means is, if you can't enforce a confidentiality agreement, if you can't afford to hire a lawyer and to go into court and take that on, then you're really hoping that the other side is going to follow their obligations. What this means is you still have to have the confidentiality agreement, but you've got to do some due diligence, and that due diligence is critical to making sure that the other party isn't going to ignore their obligations. And usually the way you look at this is, what have they done in the past? You know, you've heard the expression, I'm sure, the leopard doesn't change its spots. And what will happen is, if the company has violated the terms of its agreements before, it's more likely to do so in the future. So be sure that you check out who you're talking to, and don't blindly assume that the non-disclosure agreement is going to protect you. Next, what's key is the definition of confidential information. In the form, you'll see that we define confidential information as those things that are either secret, or that the company, your company, uses efforts to maintain the secrecy with. When we look at confidentiality agreements that come from other places, often we'll find that the definition is everything under the sun. Everything is confidential information. Well, you know, that just can't be. And what we want to do is tighten it around things that are truly confidential. And so whenever you're looking at a confidentiality agreement, make sure that what's in there is confidential information. It's not everything that you receive. Next is follow-up. Sometimes during discussions, confidential information will be disclosed verbally on a back and forth basis with the various parties. And it's very important to go back, to take notes during the meeting, and then follow up immediately with a list of the things that you thought were confidential information and are subject to protection by the confidentiality agreement. Because initially out of the box, usually you're not going to have a bunch of people objecting to what you list out as confidential information. And oh, by the way, it really needs to be confidential information, stuff that's secret and new and novel, right? But on the other hand, later on, if you have to enforce that, and you don't have that that email, or you don't have the letter indicating what you thought confidential information is, then there might be a legitimate dispute about, hey, what was this? What was the appropriate disclosure? What was protected and what wasn't? So it's very important to follow up with what you think the confidentiality agreement is. Then finally, the length of the secrecy obligation. You'll find in a lot of agreements that they say the length of the secrecy obligation is 3 years or 7 years or something like this. Well, let me ask you a question. Do you know that one of the most famous trade secrets of all time is the formula to Coca-Cola? Do you realize that the formula to Coca-Cola, albeit it's been modified, has been around for 100 years or more? What if the inventors of Coca-Cola had signed a confidentiality agreement that limited the term of the confidentiality obligation to 3 or 5 or even 7 years? Well, the problem is that the shelf life of that trade secret for Coca-Cola far exceeded 7 years. And your shelf life of your intellectual property, your confidential information, may likewise exceed 7 years or 5 years or 3 years. Why put an artificial termination date on the obligation of the other party to keep it secret? Because once they don't have to keep it secret, what does that mean? That means they can use it. And so you want to be sure that the obligation for secrecy continues until the time when that information becomes public domain or readily accessible. It may never become public domain, like the formula for Coke, and may continue on for a long period of time, during which your company can utilize it and hopefully make a ton of money off of it. Now, one thing about confidentiality and non-disclosure agreements, oftentimes I see that somebody will come with one that is a mutual non-disclosure agreement. This is a key, really key piece of information. You have to be sure about what way the confidential information is going to flow. If you're the technology company or you're coming to the table to disclose what you've invented, a mutual non-disclosure agreement is not what you want. Why? Well, first off, you don't want the other side disclosing information to you. Consider this scenario. You've developed a technology, and the other side makes a comment during that technology or discussion about new improvements that you could make to your technology. Well, if you've got those improvements already in mind, now you've got a dispute. Was that other side giving you intellectual property? Were they giving you confidential information that now you're not allowed to use? These are things that you want to be sure of. So only get a mutual confidentiality agreement if in fact there's going to be disclosure on both sides. If on the other hand, there's a discussion where you're providing confidential information and the other side is listening to it to evaluate a business arrangement, then it should be a one-way confidentiality agreement that protects your information. One final piece of information here is critical, and that is when you're dealing with investors. A lot of times people will ask me for a confidentiality agreement for investors. Most of the time, professional investors will not sign a confidentiality agreement. And the idea behind that is, hey, if your secret sauce for your business or your technology is merely disclosed by laying out your business idea, then you really don't have a secret sauce. You don't have anything that's protectable in the first place. Now, if that's the case, you really got to go back to the drawing board and figure out what the secret sauce is for your business and maybe develop a little bit more. If that's not the case, then again, you can describe the what, the outcome of the use of your intellectual property, your confidential information, rather than the method by which it does it, the how of the actual know-how or trade secret that you're using. And by doing that, you can get an investor interested to see what the business is, and then later on doing a due diligence phase where a confidentiality agreement is maybe more appropriate, then the investor is more likely to sign. Okay, well, I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video when we go over the actual free NDA form. Thanks. Talk to you soon.